All right. Hey, everyone. I am doing a sort of unexpected stream. I know I had one video come out a couple days ago, and then I streamed a couple times earlier in the week. So it's been a very busy week. All right. So let's get started. Today, I will be covering a blog post that I wrote about 5 weeks ago that I put out that's on a new topic. And so some of you, well, I shouldn't say a new topic. I've covered it or at least mentioned it a few times, but I've never done a video specifically on this particular issue, which is consciousness, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, I will be making some of the same meta philosophical points about how people frame and discuss philosophical arguments. And so there will be a lot of echoes of some of the concerns that I raise with the dialectic around meta ethics and free will and some other topics. So you can kind of see this as a sort of transitional coverage of the topic of consciousness, where I'm sort of applying some of the methods, concerns, and approaches that I take, which are largely, you could say, there are elements of a quietistic approach, elements of Wittgenstein, elements of a concern with a heightened sensitivity to language, rhetoric, and pragmatics, as well as the sort of sociology of the discipline of philosophy as a whole. So there's going to be echoes of that. Now, for many of you, you may have seen that in the community section on YouTube that I wrote a post. So I'll read that here, just for people, you don't have to go over there and have a look at it. So I'll start with this, then I'll say hi for people that are starting to show up in the chat comments. I don't see anybody yet, and I only have one person watching right now. I know I kind of sprung this on everybody. So I'll read that, and then I will get to the blog post. So I'm going to cover that blog post today. We'll see where we get today. And I'm not going to be able to stick around for 3 or 4 hours. Like I actually literally can't today, even if I'm like, I'm not going to do it. And then I end up doing it. It can't happen today because I sort of have to be somewhere, fairly soon. All right. So, and then 1 second, I just have to make a couple settings adjustments. Okay, there we go. That fixes that. Awesome. No, as good as it was. No. Very cool. All right. So here's what I said in the community section. All right. I started this channel a little less than a year ago. I think I've made the same points about moral realism and meta ethics more generally more than enough times. Making the same points was the easy and comfortable choice since it didn't require me to sit down and research new topics. I think I've ironed out my main talking points more than well enough by this point. For many of you, that may have gotten repetitive and stale. It's time for something new. Meta ethics will remain a central focus of this channel. So if you like hearing me critique moral realism and defend moral anti-realism, you're not going to be disappointed. That's going to continue. But if you feel I've beaten those points to death, then this is going to be more relevant to you. So the content is going to start to expand to cover my other interests. I've begun inviting guests onto the channel to discuss some of these topics, and I'll be inviting more. Those interests include, and then I list several of those. So it's going to be meta philosophy, a big interest of mine. I know this comes up a lot, intuitions, philosophical methods, that sort of thing. I want to broaden the scope of that coverage and not just keep raising the same sorts of points I raise about it, but start bringing guests on that both share similar perspectives or sort of adjacent perspectives. And I'm sort of deviating from what I wrote here because why not? It's my channel. I can do what I want. But also people that are maybe more pro intuition or pro the use of intuitions, which, that's oversimplifying things. Cause I'm not saying, you should never use intuitions. And other people are like, it's all intuitions all the time for everything. Nobody really has positions that are that extreme for the most part. It's really, of course, things are more complicated than that. But I want to bring on people with a variety of perspectives other than my own, in part, especially for those of you who have largely had a window into the basically just my perspective on the matter. And you may or may not have seen a lot of people do much explicit and direct coverage of it. I really want to bring people on that have different perspectives on that topic, especially people that have more critical or most importantly, different things to say to me, whether critical or in agreement. Some of that will cover experimental philosophy. Experimental philosophy isn't always and necessarily metaphilosophical in its aims and approach. Some of it, I think the topics are just interesting, and a lot of them look more like cognitive or social psychology. Another topic, which I haven't discussed a whole lot on the channel, but I definitely want to start including more, is meta sciences broadly. What is science? How do we do science? Questions like that. A big focus for me is on science as an academic institution and the sorts of things that we could do to improve it. So a big emphasis for me is peer review. I haven't discussed this much, but I'm fairly skeptical of the efficacy and the centrality of peer review as a system that is it's supposed to be super central to science and academia more broadly. I'm pretty skeptical of it. Another is the academic institutions themselves. So disciplinary divisions, the way in which we, award people and people advance in their careers, the journal publication system. I am skeptical or critical of a great deal of that, and it's not something I've ever really covered to a significant extent on this channel. I may have alluded to it, but I haven't, again, brought guests on or really made that a major focus. So that's another thing I'm going to be focusing on. Another, and this is more near and dear to me, is psychological methods. So if you're not aware, the field of psychology, and a lot of this originated with social psychology, but it really affects the psychology and the social sciences as a whole, is this event that started about, I would say about 10, 12 years ago, the replication crisis. It's often people pinpointed it around 2011, where this really came to a sort of peak, and it hasn't really fully abated, that replication crisis zone that we seem to have been in for over a decade now. I think a lot of it really, maybe it took 4 or 5 years, around 2015, for things to really become very explicit. There was a publication of a paper that attempted to replicate 100 studies in top psychology journals, and depending on how you calculate, it was about a third. It was a little over a third. It was like 36 or 39%, I think, depending on how they were calculating it. Replicated. I'm not going to get into exactly what a replication is now, and all the details associated with that. But basically, it's when you attempt to rerun the same study and see if you get the same findings. So if only about a third of studies are replicating, that's a problem. But there's been so much focus on the replication crisis that there's been comparatively little focus on issues that are of significant concern to me, a big one being measurement and validity. So, imagine if scientists were going out, imagine if you had a thermometer and, you measure the temperature with it. It's important, if you measure in the same spot and it is in fact the same temperature, that you get the same temperature reading again, or something very, very similar, because it's important that, that particular thermometer works. But you have a problem, which is, what if you always get the same temperature, but it's actually miscalibrated with the temperature, the actual real temperature? Well, then your thermometer is useless, even if it's very consistent. So one problem with a lot of psychological research, and I suspect that this generalizes to research more generally, is if you have bad measures, if you have an unreliable measure, you're going to end up in this garbage in, garbage out situation, where it doesn't matter how consistent and replicable your finding is if your finding isn't tracking the world as it actually is. And this issue of measurement validity is a very big problem in psychology. It was a major part of my own psychological research and my dissertation work, where what I really focused on was the issue of validity in a small area of experimental philosophy, specifically metaethics. But when I looked at other areas like free will, like experimental philosophy, free will, I found similar concerns. And all throughout my exposure to, reading papers, being in seminars, going to talks, all that sort of thing, this is a recurring and ubiquitous feature of psychological research, problems of measurement validity. So I'm going to be talking more about that. And then also free will. It's of some interest. There's only so much I could say about it, and that one exhausts me a lot more quickly than metaethics. I think and this is one I did a poll a few weeks ago, asking people what they were interested in. This is the most popular, was consciousness. So I know, also I should say, free will is very popular right now because Robert Sapolsky just put out a book on free will and determinism. So, who knows, maybe I'll reach out to Sapolsky and see if he would like to come on and talk about that book. And then also, again, so back over to consciousness. Some of it will be experimental philosophy of consciousness, but also I just want to talk about consciousness more generally. Now, I could actually just say very quickly, and in fact, when I get to the thing I'm going to be talking about today, I'll mention it again. My own view is called qualia quietism. The only paper where I've seen this view explicitly articulated and is in a paper by Pete Mandic on qualia quietism and meta-illusionism. That's, again, probably a topic for another day to get into more detail about that. And then finally, I am also working on some discussion of existential risk associated with artificial general intelligence. That's outside my own area of expertise, but it is I guess you could say, an interest of mine, and I would like to interact more with communities that I'm not. I wouldn't say that I'm actively involved with, like, the communities concerned with artificial general intelligence and, like, just extra stuff in generally. But that topic is picking up. A lot of people are talking about it, and it does intersect with a variety of philosophical topics, including metaethics. The orthogonality thesis is relevant to that, to consciousness, to a variety of other topics. So, I do think it's relevant, it's interesting, and, to me at least, and it's sufficiently different from the other stuff that I feel like it's worth mentioning. Hey, here's going to be another angle that I'm going to take, and it's sufficiently different that I want something on this channel. I want this channel to be broader in scope. I know some people, a lot of channels that cover topics in philosophy will just cover all kinds of stuff: epistemology, metaphysics, all sorts of stuff, theories of time. But I don't really do that. I've been fairly narrow. Now, I should say, part of, I think, what happened is that I had a kind of a dissertation tunnel vision, which is, I got so locked in to my dissertation work that, it was hard to get out of the mindset of just focusing on that topic so much. So I feel like I was running off of metaethics inertia for the past year, because I've had the channel now for not quite a year. It'll be a year in a month or two. I think my first was, yeah, it was in January, I believe. So it's been about 10 months. So 10 months is enough of, you know, focusing so much on metaethics that it's time to, I guess the sort of a self-imposed tunnel vision is starting to widen back up, and the other interests are sort of seeping back in. So it's as much me sort of returning to a degree of normalcy as it is recognizing a need to not allow the content of the channel to stagnate. Okay, so that covers that whole thing. So that's what I wanted to mention there. So let's see, we got a couple people here. I don't know if I've seen you here before. Sneer says, "Hi, Lance. Hello. How's it going?" And we've got Andy Stewart who says, "Hi, Lance. Love your channel. Thank you." All right. So for whoever's around, if you have stuff to say about all that, I feel like, I'm giving a class lecture where I'm like, does anyone have questions? And no one ever does when you ask that. That people, that want to ask questions are going to ask them regardless of whether you invite them to do so. So do please let me know if there's any thoughts or commentary on that. Oh, great. We've got Brenda. I haven't seen you around in a while. Maybe it's because I haven't been doing as many Saturday streams, and I've been popping on here at random sorts of times, but it's good to have you. All right. So, that being said, let's get into it today. So this was, yeah, like I said, this was a blog post from a few weeks ago. This one was a little bit more because in this blog post, I actually review a paper. And so it was a little bit more work than me just dashing something off, like someone said something I don't like on Twitter, that sort of thing. And I guess it's somewhat relevant to some of the stuff that's been coming up lately. So a big popular topic in the philosophy YouTube world right now has been psychophysical harmony. So I do have a few blog posts on that, and I did have a discussion about that. So maybe I'll return to that at some point. But a lot of the reactions I've seen, like the critiques and objections to psychophysical harmony, I think give it too much credit. And so there's, a lot of the responses seem to me to not challenge whether there are the types of mental states or that they have the particular metaphysical features that seem to be presumed or that go unstated when people are describing it. And also, in some cases, there's a lot of normative considerations that seem to me to go unchallenged. I heard some recent talk of people talking about, certain sorts of facts being reason giving. And so, a lot of people will just run with that as if a fact can be reason giving, whatever that's supposed to mean. And there just isn't sufficient concern from people discussing philosophical issues with just taking a step back and going, hold up, is what this person's saying making any sense? Is it substantive? Is it meaningful? Just what do they mean by this? You do have the reverse problem where people will just go, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And I do think that could be a really a sort of a conversation stopping strategy. It's something I do I guess some things you learn from online philosophical debate, which is something very different from academic philosophical debate. One of the things that can happen is if you take an approach like my own, where you're very focused on language and ambiguity and clarity and making sure that when someone is saying something that you understand what they mean and that what they're saying is substantive, it's meaningful. One of the kinds of moves that people will make when you do that, someone goes around saying that there are I don't know, transcendental, like just to make something up. Someone says there's transcendental values and you can't dispute those as if you can't be an anti-realist because of transcendental value. And if you ask someone what they mean by that, because that's not like an everyday term. It's not a term. It's not like you are down, over at the grocery store and, you're buying some groceries and someone's like, but you should buy this product instead of that product because it has more transcendental. No one talks that way. Philosophers talk that way. So you would think, because it's not a part of ordinary language where you can just presume people are doing something with this language, they're using it. Let's go find out how they're using it. This is something philosophers came up with. Okay, so if you then ask that person and they give you a bizarre, dodgy answer, like they just introduce more technical terms, and you go, okay, what do you mean by those? And then they introduce more technical terms, and they never sort of sync up what they're saying with anything you can relate to. You will never gain any sort of conceptual entry point. So even if they're up on a high mountain of sophisticated enlightenment, you're going to need ropes or a grappling hook, or you're going to need to have some way of sort of conceptually climbing that mountain. And if they're not able to help you out, you're not going to get there and you're not going to know what they're talking about. Now, it's possible that there really is something up on top of that mountain. They're claiming Zeus is up on the top of that mountain. That's fine. Maybe Zeus is on the top of the mountain, but it's not entirely the onus on the sort of person listening to someone making these sorts of claims to like figure out what people mean. People have some responsibility to be clear about what they're talking about. And in many of my experiences, philosophers are just not clear. And often what they'll do is they'll resort to saying stuff like, it's obvious, it's self-evident, it's an unanalyzable concept. And so, it's not reasonable for you to keep asking what I mean all the time. You'll get people being incredulous. They'll say, well, surely you must know what I mean. And if you say no, they're like, oh, come now, you know what I mean. That kind of thing. I really don't like it when people do that. And they'll act like the problem is always you if they're not being clear. I mean, I could go around muttering, blah, blah, blah. And then someone's like, what are you saying? And I'm like, oh, so you didn't understand me. Ha, ha, ha. If someone else isn't making sense, it could be because you're not equipped well to understand them. It could be that they're not making sense. And I suspect a lot of times philosophers are not. And, the final fallback for many of them is simply them, saying, but we know what we mean. So if you don't get it, that's, you're the problem. Okay, that I don't think any of you know what you mean. If you encountered one person that was saying just completely, colorless green ideas slit furiously, and you're like, what are you talking about? And they're like, oh, how can you not understand me? Hey, my colleague that was trained in this, who read the book about how colorless green ideas slit furiously. You agree that colorless green ideas slit furiously is totally meaningful and is a very important claim. Oh, yes, I certainly do. And then you run into their whole group and they're all wearing like green robes and they're like, colorless green ideas slit furiously. We all agree. So you're the problem. Yeah, I'm not intimidated by lots and lots of philosophers all saying the same inscrutable, mysterious nonsense that none of them seem to be capable of explaining. Anyway, for someone outside the field, they might think, okay, well, that many smart people, they must know what they're talking about. But I think they can dupe themselves into thinking they know what they're talking about. And that has the unfortunate consequence of duping a lot of other people. So, we really have to be careful about language. So I don't even know what my original point was, but language is a problem. But, psychophysical harmony. People are not addressing that in the way I do, which is to raise concerns about potentially diffusing what's being articulated as potentially just not saying much of anything meaningful at all in the first place. Oh, right. So I see a few comments here, and then I'll get into the post. And I'll give a little more context for it before I do that. Oh, right. So, sorry. Brenda asks, I've never understood what psychophysical harmony means. Does it mean brain activity should correspond to beliefs? We have that. it's not a matter of whether it corresponds or not. It's a matter of there being certain sorts of relationships between certain types of states and certain other types of states that would be difficult to explain, or perhaps not possible to explain without certain sorts of considerations. Otherwise, they would appear to be sort of coincidental, and that would be surprising. And so then the question is, how do we explain to what could account for them? And my understanding is that certain kinds of non-reductive physicalism are really going to struggle to handle accounting for them. And so then, hey, we've got some alternative proposals that can do the job. Theistic accounts, maybe some sort of teleological account. It doesn't necessarily have to be theistic. But another alternative you could take in responding to psychophysical harmony is to just reject that there's anything to harmonize in the first place. So if you take that route and you just go with some type of illusionism or some other type of account that rejects a whole, half of what is supposed to be harmonized with the other half in the first place, then the problem isn't solved so much as dissolved. You don't have to account how, if there's two phenomena and they seem to be in tension or it's hard to explain the relationship between them, okay, and if someone says, okay, but this account can explain the relationship between them, maybe it can. And it could be that certain sorts of naturalistic or certain kinds of physicalist accounts can't explain the relationship between, certain types of mental and physical phenomenon. But if the way in which the metaphysical characteristics of the putative mental phenomena are such that you just reject that there is any such thing, then there's nothing to harmonize in the first place. It's not like, how do you explain the relationship between A and B? If you're an illusionist, you could just say, yeah, there's no A. There's nothing to harmonize. And that can solve the problem too. And so if you're looking at these options, if you're looking at reductive physicalism, non-reductive physicalism, and some type of non-physicalist account, to me, the argument is set up in a way where they're like, look, we're going to set aside the reductive physicalist accounts. And we're going to say, okay, we have a problem. The non-reductive physicalism really struggles to solve it. And we can solve it with this other cluster of approaches, which happens to include theism. Fair enough if that's true. That may or may not be true. I think that people that want to defend some type of non-reductive physicalism may resist that type of argument. But often I just want to, rip the dialectical Band-Aid off and just say, look, it's not so much that I'm trying to rescue certain kinds of views that some of my colleagues may be sympathetic to, some sort of accounts that straddle the middle ground between the more extreme empiricist views that I tend to favor and the ones that, a lot of other people favor, some type of substance dualism or that sort of thing. I just to hell with the middle ground in a lot of cases. I'm not sympathetic with it at all. So I reject the middle ground and, the views on the other side. So if you look at the paper where psychophysical harmony, the paper that sort of, I guess, sparked this online discussion of it, which is cool. It's cool that it sparked so much discussion. I like to see a paper get attention and be successful. The kind of accounts that I favor, the illusionist sort of accounts. My position, quality quietism, is in some respects a little bit more extreme than illusionism, but I actually think the position ends up looking very similar to, Dennett has made comments. Dennett is probably the most prominent proponent of illusionism, along with Keith Frankish. Dennett has made some remarks that make it look like, to me, there's almost no difference, substantively, in the kind of account I favor and the kind of account that Dennett favors, although we may disagree about the meaningfulness of quality terminology. But, there's not that much of a difference between being, for instance, there's not that much of a practical difference between saying, hey, that stuff those other people are proposing, it doesn't exist, versus, hey, that stuff those other people are saying that's trying to describe stuff, yeah, it's just nonsense. And because an implication of that is they're not describing something that does exist. So the two positions end up looking pretty similar. So my reaction to that psychophysical harmony stuff has just been, this looks to me like you could use it to make a great argument for illusionism. So, or some type of eliminativism, I guess. Okay. So Sneer says, I've been a long-time follower, but didn't engage much at all. Anyway, I've recently stumbled across humorous ontological proof of moral realism. Have you read, heard it, and or commented on it? Yes, I've actually read the paper, I think probably 2 or 3 times now. So again, this is a case where there are plausibly going to be grounds for making more substantive objections. I'm not going to get into those. But the argument, if you look at the paper, from the very outset, when the argument starts to be formalized, it starts appealing to precisely the kinds of non-naturalist, realist use of terminology that I find at best underspecified, ambiguous, and in need of further clarification, but which I suspect is actually literally meaningless. And so one reaction I have to these ontological arguments is that a lot of them try to get the foot in the door by saying, look, as long as you're compelled to assign some degree of non-zero probability to moral realism being true, the argument is going to go through. But I actually think that I'm not compelled to assign any type of non-zero probability to the claim or the proposition that moral realism is true. If it's unintelligible, it's not technically a proposition. And so it's not really something that for which one could assign a probability at all. And so once again, I think I can just sort of skirt the entire problem from the outset by saying, I don't even have to take the first step down the path towards in like deeper territory. Now, I think a lot of people find that unsatisfying. If someone has a 8 premise argument, you just say, yeah, premise 1's wrong, done. Like I just reject premise 1 and I'm not even going to look further, which you don't need to if you reject premise 1. If premise 1 is wrong, it doesn't matter how many other premises there are. But for some people, it's like, hold on, so you're not even going to bother with the rest of it. I do think the rest is worth bothering with. Is worth exploration, but it's a little hard. It's a little innervating to push oneself to address additional premises where one has to like sort of put on their analytic philosopher cap and say, well, setting aside the fact that I think what the person's saying is probably just completely nonsensical and doesn't mean anything, let's just suppose for the sake of argument it was meaningful. Now let's consider what some of the problems might be with other premises or elements of the argument that are not themselves meaningless, which certainly it's not like I think the humorous ontological argument is just word for word meaningless. Of course not. Big parts of it are going to be meaningful and they could be examined on their own terms. But yeah, it's hard to work up the motivation to do that when you feel like the argument can't even get off the ground in the first place. Doesn't mean I don't think it can't be done though. So yeah, I'm familiar with it. It's not the sort of thing for which I've really sat down and prepared some kind of systematic response. I also do think it's worth giving credit for like a novel argument for moral realism. So I think humor is owed some credit for really doing the work. Because humor could just say, I endorse phenomenal conservatism. I take this ethical intuitionist approach. Seems like realism is true to me, good enough for me, and anti-realist arguments aren't convincing. And so we're in a good place to endorse moral realism, which probably, I suspect, I shouldn't say probably, I suspect that's probably what humor would think, but humor doesn't just go, okay, well, I'm content with that. No, humor has actually put forward substantive positive arguments for moral realism in addition to, responding to anti-realists and sort of laying the sort of ethical intuitionist groundwork. So that deserves some credit. All right. So Brenda says, I think Lance and Humor have talked. So I've never spoken with Humor, not online, not in person. But I did leave some comments on Humor's blog. I think, so I think maybe 2 years ago now, it was a while ago. And there was a little bit of back and forth, but not a whole lot. So that's about the extent of our exchange. All right. We have Gil. Is it Git Stanfield? Anyway, hello. So Stanfield says, and let me know. Hey, Lance, new here. So welcome. It's awesome to have new people. Appreciate the channel. Kind of listening in the background, but I'm still trying to understand what the psychophysical harmony argument even is. Well, I don't really have it set up in front of me or notes to like say, here's what the argument is. And if I'm going to talk about it, I'd really like to bring someone on the stream that endorses the argument, because I'd like to get a really charitable articulation of what it would be. Because, if I pull open the paper, like I would just have to read it off. If I try to paraphrase, I might butcher elements of it. So I'd prefer to do that. I'm just not covering psychophysical harmony at length this week. I'm not ready to do that. I'd prefer to do a little more prep to cover that. So maybe I could get someone, if people are into the topic, get someone to come onto the stream to talk about it. That would be cool. And I'm sure that there's people that would be interested in talking about it. But yeah, if I'm going to do a video on that, I want to go over the paper again, because I read that months ago that I read that and wrote a few blog posts about it. And there's a lot of parts to that paper. It's a pretty robust paper with quite a bit going on in it. I wouldn't say it's like, it's not like technically the most complicated thing in the world. It's incomprehensible, but it's the kind of thing that off the cuff, it's not my area, not what I work on. I wouldn't want to say, here's what the argument is. I would want to go do a bit of review. So yeah, and again, probably better to get somebody on that really knows about it. So yeah, there is a paper on it, and I'm sure you could find coverage if you look around on it. Also, I should say, what am I talking about? So Digital Gnosis or Nathan and James Fodor just did a really long, it was like a 6-hour stream where I'm sure you could skip around to get to. In fact, I know I checked, they did do timestamps on it. Let me pull that up because they put way more work than me into really covering this on their channel. So why don't I just pull that up and direct everybody over to that? And then you'll get people that spent a lot more time and recently reviewing and covering it. There's no point in me reinventing the wheel if other people have already done it. Although I would have some different things to say. You could also find, if you go to my blog and you search, you could find my comments on psychophysical harmony that I wrote where, I paper by Cutter and Crummett, and I'm responding to specific points being made. And that's like when it was fresh in my mind. And like, I'm like, here's what I think about this at the time. So I have several posts about that you could check out. Oh, wow. Was that really 6 days ago? It feels like it just happened that they were covering this. That's wild. So much time passes so quickly. So there's the video. Do check that out. So that's not going to help you who's going to type that in. But it's there. Do check it out. So that's Bad Apologetics 24, Psychophysical Harmony. And just go check that out. Again, it is timestamped. So there's so much that they cover in here. So it's at the 3-hour and 20-minute mark where they talk about Crummett's paper. So, and yeah, it's a cool paper. I'm just going to disagree with certain fundamental elements of it. So there's that. And they did do a follow-up on that, I think a day or two ago. Maybe I'm just mixing the two up in my head. Let me pull up my papers, or not papers, blog posts on this. I'll link those just so you don't have to go searching for them. I'm seeing if I search for harmony, if they're just going to come up right away. Yep, they do. Cool. Oh, wow. Did I really do that many? I did 5 posts on this. Okay. I did more than I thought. I remembered writing that much about it. Wow. Okay. All right. So let me post these here. You know what? I'll post them and then pin it after the stream is over so you can find them. So you could find, I'll post the first one here. But that way I'm not like wasting your time searching and organizing these and putting them in the stream where you're not going to be able to check. But again, if you just go to my blog, you'll be able to find them. So I wrote apparently a whole bunch. I think I got I was in a stream and I said something. So I listened to the first part of the stream, and I think it was Crummett that was a guest on, I think, Capturing Christianity. And I heard the first few minutes of it, and they brought up dualism and said something like they're assuming dualism for the sake of the argument. And then I said something really dumb, as I was like, you could reject dualism and still endorse whatever it was. And they're very explicit, like in the video. It's just I didn't listen long enough because I was like an hour late when they'd started, and I was trying to catch up, and I was listening at double speed. And they're very explicit in the paper as well. Like here, like if you assume dualism, you could like work through what all the implications and everything are, but you don't have to. And the argument works perfectly well without assuming dualism, and that's true. So I got a little overly enthusiastic, and then I felt embarrassed about it. And so I'm making a conscious point of saying, I jumped the gun. I got too excited about it, making some point that I was like, haha, this is a good point. And it was a terrible point. I was completely and totally wrong. And I just needed to be a little more patient. And that got under my skin. I was like, no, I will not let it be the case that my interaction with psychophysical harmony is to just say a very stupid and obviously incorrect thing and then just leave it there. So I went and I found the paper and I listened to the rest of the video, and I read the paper and I took notes, and then I wrote a comment. I don't know how quickly I wrote I probably got too excited and wrote the comment before I did all of that. But I did all of that, and then I ended up blogging about it. And this was back in, wow, it was February. So yeah, it was a long time. Okay, so like what, 9 months ago? Yeah. So I do not remember everything that I read in that paper. There have been I don't know, a few dozen papers between then and now, and conversations and all that. So do check that out. And yeah, you'll also be able, you can find the article here. Yeah. So, and I linked to the paper itself. So you'll be able to find the paper that I'm responding to, and then the blog posts on that. And then Nathan and James cover it too. Cool. Okay. Let's see what else people have said. So this looks like it was from about 15 minutes ago. Pixeldan says, I'm doing a bit of research on the concept of beauty in mathematics, and it's exactly that all the way down. So I don't know what exactly I was saying 15 minutes ago, but if it was stuff about things being meaningless and nonsensical, let me know, because it wouldn't surprise me if beauty in mathematics, a lot of that talk ended up being questionable. So this is a common reaction. This is an interesting one. One second. Inyenzi says, illusionism strikes me as completely insane and borderline immoral, and that it denies the existence of phenomenal suffering. That is a fascinating take, and it's something that is actually relevant to the blog post that I'm going to be reading. So let's table that remark, and I'll get through the blog post, and then we can return to that. I hope you stick around, because so this remark again, I'll read it again. So this is from Inyenzi. Borderline immoral in that it denies the existence of phenomenal suffering. So illusionism does deny the existence of phenomenal suffering. I don't think there's anything immoral about that, and I don't think there's anything insane about illusionism. So cool. Okay, that covers everything. Cool. So I am not going to delay any further, and I will get straight into the blog post. So today, oh, and then of course I closed the blog post. So give me a second, and I'll pull it back up. So I'm going to read through this one. That's not, always the most exciting way to do things, but it's, hey, people do scripted content. So let's see it as practice. And then maybe what I say in there will be better than the kinds of unprepared things that I abruptly say. There we go. All right, so let's get started. Yeah, and my section titles are not very exciting. Oh, right, I said I was going to give some more context. So if you go to the blog post for this, I'll post it real quick. I said I'm going to get started, and then I don't. Here's the blog post for that. So so it's called Super Morian Land, which the reference is obvious, but it also, the idea of Super Morian intuitions does actually come up in the paper that I'm responding to. So it actually is relevant to the paper. So yeah. Anyway, let me get started here. All right. I called myself an illusionist for a long time. Strong illusionism is the view that phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist, but we operate under the mistaken impression, i.e., the illusion, that it does. One might opt for a more modest form, which holds that phenomenal consciousness does exist, but isn't quite what we suppose. It might be missing some key characteristics ordinarily thought to be part of phenomenal consciousness. I endorse the former. So that is, I endorsed strong illusionism. However, my views gradually shifted away from this position, only not in the direction one might suppose. Many philosophers regard illusionism as, quote, radical, absurd, extreme, or preposterous. I've even heard people suggest that the view is so ridiculous that nobody could seriously endorse it. After all, the manifest fact that we have phenomenally conscious states is self-evident. It is perhaps the one thing we couldn't doubt. So one might think I'd announce some deconversion story where I saw the light qualia and came back into the fold. This isn't what has happened. Instead, I came to believe that illusionism doesn't go far enough. Illusionists hold that 1. Phenomenal states don't exist, i.e., private, ineffable, immediately accessible qualitative states. Don't take that set of traits to necessarily be exhaustive. So as a note on phenomenal states or qualia, I use the terms interchangeably. And there is ongoing controversy about just how to characterize qualia, phenomenal state. People will dispute which properties they have, which properties they don't have. So I tend to go with the characterization given, very roughly the characterization, because this isn't perfectly or identical to the account that Dan Dennett provides in Quining Qualia. I reject specifically robust, and you could say metaphysically or epistemically robust characterizations of qualia where they have a variety of properties. It's that cluster of properties that I'm going to take concern with, not any and all usages of the term qualia. If you're using the term qualia in some theoretically neutral way to just refer to subjective experience, however that's philosophically cashed out, I don't think that there are no qualia of that kind, or that type of qualia is nonsensical, because you're using it in a way that's theoretically neutral. There's going to be a sense of subjective experience I would endorse. So that's not going to be a problem. The problem is when you have a term like that, you have to be careful not to equivocate or Martindale and really move the term between its more substantive and committed usages and its less substantive and committed usages. You just have to be careful. Okay, anyway, so let me roll it back. Illusionists hold that 1, phenomenal states don't exist. 2, all or most people, or at least some substantial proportion of non-philosophers, are subject to the illusion that they have phenomenal states. And then 3, this is not strictly a requirement, but it seems implicitly presumed, the notion of a phenomenal state, or qualia, is intelligible. It's just that they don't exist. I take illusionism to involve a commitment to A and B, but not necessarily C. I'm not sure when exactly I began to doubt either of these claims. I say either, but I guess it's A and B. But my views on both crystallized when I ran into Mandik's 2016 paper on qualia quietism and meta-illusionism. Meta-illusionism, roughly speaking, denies B, while qualia quiet. So, you might take the standard illusionist account to be very simply, phenomenal states don't exist, but people mistakenly think that they do. And implicit in that is that the notion of a phenomenal state may be intelligible. Like, it makes sense to talk about them. It's just that we're wrong. It's kind of like an error theory about phenomenal states. But my view rejects both that second claim, that all or most people are subject to the illusion that they have phenomenal states, and it also denies the implicit presumption that the notion of qualia phenomenal states is intelligible. What I will say is that Dennett has made remarks where there's kind of a difference between whether or not people are subject to a certain kind of user illusion, a sort of a narrative center of gravity, where different types of sensory inputs give people the false impression that their sensations are all sort of occurring in some sort of like central location where everything's happening simultaneously. I do think people are subject to that kind of user illusion. What I don't think is that people are subject to a kind of a philosophical sense that they have qualia. So I don't think people have like qualia intuitions or are committed to the view that they have phenomenal consciousness. I think some philosophers are clearly committed to that, probably the majority. But I don't think that most ordinary people have some sort of, by ordinary, I mean people without substantive philosophical training, are subject to a kind of philosophical or intellectual illusion. They're only subject to, I guess you could say, that cognitive illusion. And so you could, and Dennett has drawn this distinction, at least as far as I could tell, I may be misunderstanding, between that sort of cognitive and the philosophical illusion. I'm only a meta-illusionist about the philosophical illusion or the intellectual illusion, not the cognitive illusion. I still think that that's a real thing. And so if Dennett and I agree on that, then actually we're pretty much just on the same page. And the only thing we would disagree about is this third claim. Also, I'm just noticing that I numbered it 1, 2, 3, and then when I comment on it, it's ABC. I'm going to have to fix that. That always happens when you go through these, that you run into these goofy things. Anyway, let me continue with the commentary. Okay, I'm not sure when exactly I began to doubt either of these claims, but my views on both crystallized when I ran into Mandik's paper on qualia quietism and meta-illusionism. Meta-illusionism roughly denies B, while qualia quietism denies C. That is, Mandik puts forward the views that 1, terms like phenomenal state qualia and what its likeness aren't meaningful, and 2, illusionists mistakenly think that people are generally subject to the illusion that there are phenomenal states, but even this is not true. I do add parenthetically that Mandik seems less committed to this claim. So, it's kind of like, maybe that one's not going to fly quite as well, assuming again that I understood Mandik. But the qualia quietism does seem to be pushed more sort of forcefully in the paper. It's not pushed super forcefully, but like of the two, it seems to be the more confident. Anyway, What if the notion of qualia, phenomenal states, are philosophical terms of art that capture the output of conceptual or linguistic confusions characteristic of analytic philosophy? I am increasingly coming around to the view that philosophers are routinely subject to mistaken presumptions. Among these presumptions is the notion that much of the way philosophers think is reflected in the way ordinary people speak and think, and that if philosophers find themselves vexed by some conundrum, that this puzzle is an output of what ordinary people are thinking and doing. I suspect this is often not the case, and that the puzzles philosophers face are problems of their own making. To address this in the context of consciousness, I want to raise some concerns about what illusionists themselves have to say. Part of my concern with illusionism is that its lack of appeal may be due in part to attempting to vindicate the position within the framework of contemporary analytic philosophy, rather than taking a step back and considering the possibility that the problems may be more fundamental. I suspect that the sorts of mistakes that led to the mistaken notion that there are, or could be, phenomenal states is downstream of broader methodological problems within the field. Given that I think certain forms of moral realism rely on meaningless terms, this is a recurring theme, but I don't think it's a coincidence. I suspect both mistakes share common overlapping causes. Section 2 is called the Morian argument for a phenomenal consciousness. To this end, I want to examine a recent paper by Kammerer, which was published in 2022. How can you be so sure? Illusionism and the obviousness of phenomenal consciousness. Kammerer offers a rebuttal to a Moorean argument against illusionism, which holds that illusionism is false because it is obvious that we have phenomenal consciousness. I like Kammerer's paper. Kammerer targets what I take to be incredibly weak arguments and does a good job of identifying weaknesses in those arguments. Most laudably, this involves picking apart multiple possible meanings behind the premises. However, where I take issue is not with Kammerer's objections, but with a kind of concessive regard for the arguments that are criticized. The overall vibe is one where Kammerer is dealing with a seemingly impenetrable fortress of powerful arguments. When the arguments are so weak, it's more like knocking down sandcastles. This is an example of the dialectical norms I dislike in academia. Arguments too much credit. If insincere and motivated by politeness, then philosophers are pulling their punches in ways that are detrimental. Sometimes an argument shouldn't be met with, quote, I respectfully disagree with my esteemed colleague, but with instead, quote, wow, that's complete bullshit. I grant that perhaps an overly caustic tone could provoke one's colleagues and perhaps risk one's chance of publication, and I don't favor an explicitly hostile polemic. As a result, I don't intend the remarks that follow to be a critique of the way Kammerer handles these criticisms. I think the criticisms are good, I mostly agree with them, and I understand why one wouldn't include remarks like, this is ridiculous, what the Socrates is this, in the middle of an academic paper. Indeed, it's even possible reviewers or editors would ask one to tone down the force of one's criticisms were they a bit too acerbic. Instead, I would prefer to construe this as a critique of the overall norms and atmosphere in the academic philosophical community. There is an excessive politeness of kids' gloves of treating bad arguments with undue gravitas as though every goofy premise, every silly claim, every dogmatic assertion is a boss monster at the end of a game and not some red shirt you could bulldoze past by pressing X. Section 2.1, a Morian objection to Morian arguments. And before I get to that, I'm going to just pause briefly just to make sure everything is going okay in the stream. You know, if I could show up and then people are like, hey, you accidentally muted yourself 10 minutes ago. All right, everything looks fine, so let's keep going. According to Kammerer, Morian arguments against illusionism beg the question against illusionism. Does one really need to argue for this, though? Of course it's begging the question. All Morian arguments are question-begging, dressed up in finery. Yet skeptics, critics, and anti-realists of various stripes often accord such maneuvers with far too much respect, agreeing that this or that claim does seem obvious, buying into the presumptions or sharing the possibly distorted phenomenology or inferences about one's phenomenology that characterize the position they proceed to reject. I'm not saying that this must be the case. Perhaps some things seem obvious because they're true. I grant that illusionists do share the intuition that, I should say, many illusionists share the intuition that proponents of phenomenal states have, and do find much of what proponents of the hard problem obvious to be obvious. What troubles me is that there seems inadequate attention as to why this might be so. What if proponents and critics share similar intuitions, not because the claims in question are the sorts of intuitions any reasonable person would have or that human minds are naturally disposed towards, but because they were both inducted into a similar philosophical tradition or are members of similar cultures, and features of their education or enculturation, or both, dispose them towards shared intuitions for reasons unrelated to the plausibility of the intuitions in question? What if, in other words, even our disposition to think that there are phenomenal states or qualia is itself a parochial and idiosyncratic feature of our environment, not some universal, widely shared tendency rational minds find themselves in at the outset of inquiry? Mandic hints at such a possibility, suggesting that illusionists may be subject to the mistaken presumption that people are subject to an illusion. But perhaps the illusion is a product of training in philosophy, not something people are generally disposed towards. History is replete with confident pronouncements that this or that notion just stands to reason or is obvious, only for future discoveries to reveal that we were simply wrong. Things that seem obvious and are false seem just as obvious as things that are obvious and true. This leaves such skeptical positions at a dialectical disadvantage, granting more than is necessary precisely because the skeptic is themselves caught in the same web of conceptual confusions, phenomenal distortions, and flawed methods of rival views. The disadvantage comes in the form of holding a counterintuitive position, leaving the door open for proponents of the view they reject to insist that the critics' defeaters aren't good enough to overcome the obvious a given position is. This always allows the proponent of a view to employ an unlimited epistemic fudge factor that renders them the final arbiter of the success of your arguments. One moment. That may be an unavoidable aspect of how we go about forming beliefs and assessing evidence. It is one thing to say that, given one's priors or other commitments, one isn't persuaded, and another to imply, as philosophers often do, if by omission, that because their own judgments are well calibrated, that if you don't convince them, it's because you're wrong, and not because they have misaligned priors or have misjudged the quality of the evidence. This obviousness is a blight on good philosophy, not because I deny priors or seemings or whatever are relevant to adjudicating rival theories, but because those seemings or what is obvious is often downstream of antecedent theoretical commitments, result from and remain plausible only in light of one's methods or are insufficiently examined in light of knowledge of human cognition and so on. They're a thin veneer, a patching over of a host of examine them, one might find the beliefs, attitudes, and dispositions shifting beneath their feet precisely in ways that influence downstream judgments about what seems obvious. This conversation-stopping, reflection-suppressing feature of Morian approaches is, to put it bluntly, a lazy and ineffective way to do philosophy that relies, among other things, on ignoring the fact that our judgments about what's obvious are made using cognitive systems whose internal mechanisms are relevant to assessing the reliability of those judgments. Chemists and physicists may use a variety of tools outside of their mind, but philosophers use, for the most part, one tool, the brain. It's remarkable how little interest many philosophers show in how it works, and the embarrassing and self-undermining degree to which they fail to appreciate how relevant its operations are to what they do. This is more a problem for more rationalistic approaches to philosophy, of course. I'm not talking about empiricists who are typically more sensitive to such considerations. And this is one strong point in favor of more empiricist approaches. All right. Let me see. There's a lot here, and I'm struggling to read through all of this. I think I'll have to take up reading this again another time because I'm struggling to get through it all. All right, so I'm going to pause there, and then I think I'll wrap things up for now, and I'll have to come back to reading that another time. Let's see what people have said in the chat. All right, James Apperson says, when I hear there's a philosophy that denies the existence of phenomenal suffering, I think of Stoicism. Yeah, I don't think Stoicism is related to phenomenal suffering. All right. Discourse says, haha, I don't know what that was about. Looks like that was a while ago. Okay, so for whatever reason, I don't know what's going on with me. I'm having trouble reading through things. So I think I'm going to close out the stream now. So I'm sorry about that. I don't know what's going on with me, but like I drank this whole glass of water and I'm having some kind of issue with the reading, and my throat's getting a little sore. So I don't know. Maybe it's just I don't know. So I'm not feeling super great. I'm going to wrap it up there. So thanks everybody for being here, and I'll have to do this when I'm feeling better. Alrighty, take care, everybody.